Sandra, the numbers don't add up. Never have they. Joe is my name. I've worked in finance long enough to see when there's a problem with the books, and I'm 31 years old. I've been managing compliance reviews for Kelthorne Financial, the Norfolk, Virginia-based investment company that my wife Sandra's father, Harold, started from nothing for the last 18 months. What had begun as sporadic differences had developed into a pattern that I was unable to ignore. The golden kid had always been Sandra, particularly when she joined the business 3 years ago to handle customer accounts. Harold treated her like she walked on water. He would comment, "She's got the touch," anytime someone complimented her on her performance. Natural-born businesswoman, just like her old man. However, the arithmetic wasn't working when I compared the client statements she created with the real portfolio balances. Start with little quantities, 1,000 there, a few hundred here. Retirement accounts with consistent growth on paper, but inconsistent balances in practice. Sandra would laugh it off when I brought it up to her. She would kiss my cheek and say something else, but her eyes would go icy for a while. "You're overthinking it, Joe. Dad's accounting system is old school. Sometimes transfers take time to process." Witnessing Harold's pride every time Sandra gave her quarterly reports was the hardest part. He would say, "Look at these returns," to the other advisors. I knew those clients weren't experiencing such returns, but Sandra's clients are outperforming the market by 12%. While Sandra's personal spending had increased, their actual accounts were losing money. I had been recording everything last month, screenshots showing inconsistencies, copies of fabricated statements, and records of fictitious transactions. I convinced myself that there had to be an explanation and that I was just being paranoid. However, I realized that I could no longer lie when I noticed that Mildred Peterson's account statement showed a balance of $87,000 when the actual account had $62,000. Mildred was 74. Her medical bills were to be paid for with that money. Like a loaded rifle, the file folder rested in my desk drawer. I used to greet Sandra every day when I got home, see her giggle at something on TV, and worrying whether she was robbing the folks who trusted her father with their life savings. She claimed that the BMW she received last month was a business incentive. Harold had been really proud, Sandra said, working late again. From the doorway of the kitchen, she had purchased herself a diamond bracelet on our anniversary, and she was wearing it. $2,400. I shut down my laptop and turned to face her when she added, "Another bonus. My spouse, whom I had loved for 6 years, had been married for 3, and may be ruining lives while her father rejoiced over her accomplishments." Something was going to snap. I sensed it. Sandra and I had met in a coffee shop close to the university where I was completing my degree in finance. She exuded confidence, beauty, and the ability to make everything seem possible. She would discuss how Kelthorne Financial, which her father had recently founded, would assist Norfolk households in accumulating genuine wealth. She would remark, "Not like those big firms in Richmond, and we're going to know our clients' names, their kids' names, and their dreams." Harold had initially been dubious about me. I was raised in Newport News in a working-class household. At the shipyard, my father mended boats. Sandra persuaded him that I was brilliant with numbers, even though my mom cleaned homes. He offered me a job managing compliance and audits when I graduated. When he said, "Keep us honest," he had laughed. "Can't afford any mistakes in this business." Everything seemed to be going well for the first 2 years. Sandra had a strong desire to assist her clients, sometimes staying up late to go over portfolios or answer calls from retirees who had inquiries concerning their accounts on the weekends. When Harold saw her commitment, he would smile. "She gets it," he'd say to me. "This business is about trust. People hand you their futures, and you'd better treat that like sacred ground." However, once Sandra was promoted to senior account manager, something changed. The customer calls ceased, but the late nights persisted. She claimed to have been studying new investment options or reorganizing portfolios when she returned home. Fatigued, she would get evasive when I inquired about certain clients. "You know, I can't discuss confidential client information, Joe." The first warning sign was minor. A widow named Margaret Williams, whose husband had been Harold's first customer, phoned the office to inquire as to why the sum on her monthly account differed from what she had computed. I had verified Margaret's account personally, but Sandra, who took the call, explained that it was a reporting delay in the system. Sandra said there was money, but there wasn't. I began to listen more intently. Sandra's clothes really improved. Expensive jewelry, designer purses, and regular trips to the spa. She would bring up her performance incentives whenever I questioned her about the expenditures. Although Harold had put in place a reward system, Sandra's spending greatly outstripped what the bonuses were supposed to cover. The tipping point occurred when I heard her discussing shifting the Richmond funds and maintaining the integrity of the trail over the phone with someone named Derek. Later, when I inquired about Derek, she said Harold had engaged him as a compliance consultant, although Harold had never made reference to consultants. During lunch with my father-in-law, I mentioned Derek's name casually, and he seemed perplexed. Harold had questioned, "Derek who?" "Sandra hasn't mentioned working with any outside consultants." I started the file folder that evening. Every inconsistency, every dubious transaction, every untrue lie. I convinced myself that I was safeguarding the company Harold had established, and the folks who entrusted us with their retirement funds. I was just unaware of the full extent of Sandra's treachery at the time. On December 15th, precisely 9 days before Christmas Eve, everything came together. I was looking over year-end reports when I came across something that really got to me. The 81-year-olds Thomas and Ruth Bailey had entrusted Kelthorne Financial with their $137,000 life savings. Sandra said that their account had increased to $153,000. However, when I went to the real account, the amount was $89,000, $64,000 that was stolen from the retirement savings of an elderly couple. Until far after midnight, I sat in my office, going over each account Sandra was in charge of. The pattern was meticulous and systematic. She had been using false assertions to conceal the fact that she had been embezzling money from pensioners. The victims were always elderly customers who trusted the quarterly paper statements Sandra personally made and hardly looked into their accounts online. 11 distinct families had their $218,000 taken in total. With my hands trembling on the driving wheel, I drove silently home. Sandra was humming to herself while wrapping Christmas presents in the living room when I arrived at our house. Her grin, which used to make my heart skip a beat, was warm and kind as she glanced up. "It makes me ill now. You're home late," she remarked, wrapping a package with a ribbon. "I got your sister that scarf she wanted." I observed her carefully placing the gift beneath our tree with all the other gifts she had purchased using stolen funds after she had finished wrapping it. Her January trip to Mexico, the BMW in our driveway, and the diamond bracelet on her wrist were all purchased with funds that belonged to individuals like Thomas and Ruth Bailey, who most likely couldn't afford to heat their home this winter as a result of Sandra's actions. Without raising her gaze from her wrapping, she said, "How was work?" "Fine," I said. "It wasn't okay, though." Everything was all okay. The woman Harold trusted with his business and heritage, the woman I had married, the woman I had loved, was a robber. While her father commended her work and intended to fire her from the firm, she was stealing from the most vulnerable members of our community. I opened my laptop after going upstairs. I spent the next 3 hours compiling everything into one destructive file, which included screenshots of the actual account balances, copies of the fictitious statements Sandra had made, and a thorough analysis that showed the precise amount of money that had been taken from each household. I just titled it "The Truth About Sandra" and stored everything on a flash drive. That night, I didn't get any sleep, knowing that I would have to choose between letting my wife ruin the lives of 11 innocent families and destroying her own in 9 days. I lay next to her and listened to her breathing. As it happened, the choice would be made for me. I made the decision to give Sandra one final shot on December 22nd. Perhaps I had overlooked an explanation. Perhaps the lost funds were linked to an investment plan I didn't comprehend. I had to think my wife couldn't do what the data made abundantly evident. Sandra, I began while eating breakfast. I've been reviewing some of the client accounts, and I'm seeing some discrepancies. Her coffee cup was halfway to her lips when she halted. What kind of discrepancies? I said in a casual, business-like tone. Account balances that don't match the statements. Pretty significant differences. I think we should tell your father, so we can figure out what's happening. Her expression instantly changed. The warmth disappeared, to be replaced by something calculating and chilly. Joe, you need to be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. I'm not making accusations. I'm identifying problems that need to be addressed. She put down her coffee and leaned back in her chair, asking, "Are you?" Because it sounds like you're questioning my work, my father's business, the business that pays for this house, your car, everything we have. I felt like I'd been hit. Sandra, I'm trying to protect the business. If there are problems with client accounts, sharply, there are no problems, she stated. What there is a husband who's apparently been going through confidential client files without authorization. Do you know what Harold would think about that? The danger was obvious. She intended to paint me as the issue and make it appear like I was the one acting improperly. I have authorization to review those files. It's literally my job. Your job is compliance oversight, not investigating senior account managers. She got up and smoothed her skirt. Maybe you should focus on your own responsibilities instead of trying to undermine mine. Harold summoned me to his office that afternoon. Sandra had already arrived, sitting in the chair opposite from his desk, her eyes red as if she had been sobbing, and her hands folded. With a tone of dissatisfaction, Harold replied, "Joe, Sandra tells me you've been making some concerning allegations about her client management." Sandra was looking at her hands as I turned to face her. She had reached him first and twisted the tail to suit her. "Harold, I've identified some serious discrepancies in client account balances that need immediate attention." What kind of discrepancies? Statements that don't match actual account values. In some cases, significant amounts of money that appear to be missing. Harold's expression grew serious. That's a very serious accusation. Joe, are you absolutely certain about what you're saying? I have documentation. Documentation you obtained by accessing confidential client files without proper authorization. Sandra intervened. Joe's been conducting some kind of unauthorized investigation into my work. Is that true? Inquired Harold. I was reviewing accounts as part of my compliance responsibilities. Sandra's accounts specifically, Harold replied, and I could feel the trap closing in around me. Why would you target your wife's work? There was a lingering question. How could I explain that my wife's spending habits didn't match her claimed salary? Therefore, I started looking into it. Without coming across a jealous spouse attempting to ruin his wife's profession, how could I inform Harold that his daughter was a thief? I spoke the feeble words. I review all account managers' work. Harold scratched his brow and moaned. Joe, I'm going to need you to take some time off through the holidays. We'll discuss this situation after New Year's when everyone's had a chance to cool down. Harold, please, just look at the documentation I've compiled. I don't want to see any documentation you've obtained through unauthorized access. He replied with firmness. Sandra, I want you to conduct a full review of your client accounts. Make sure everything is properly documented and up to standard. Sandra gave a serious nod. Knowing Sandra had won the first round, I left that office with the words, "Of course, Dad, I'll have everything organized by the time Joe returns from his break." Harold really believed her when she presented herself as the victim of an overly ambitious spouse. Even worse, she now had time to hide her traces and advance notice. Sandra was unexpectedly loving that evening. She poured a bottle of wine, prepared my favorite supper, and discussed ways we may rekindle our romance on my vacation. Her words, "Maybe this is a blessing in disguise," came as she curled up on the couch next to me. "We can spend Christmas Eve with my family and really enjoy the holidays." I grinned and nodded, but I was secretly calculating. Sandra believed she had eliminated the danger. Harold believed he had resolved a personnel issue. Neither of them was aware that I still had copies of everything had found on the flash drive, which was concealed in my desk at home. They believed they had triumphed. They were unaware that the game was only getting started. It all changed when I got a call on Christmas Eve morning, when Sandra was in the salon getting ready for her family's celebration. I recognized Derek Morrison from the phone conversation Sandra had been having with him weeks before. Derek was not a compliance consultant, though. He was employed as a private investigator to look into anomalies in customer accounts by Kelthorne Financial's insurance provider. "Mr. Williams," Derek said, "I understand you've been conducting your own investigation into account discrepancies at Kelthorne Financial." My heart was pounding. "How did you know about that?" "Because your father-in-law hired me 3 months ago after receiving complaints from 2 clients about statement inconsistencies. I've been building a case, and I believe your wife is at the center of a significant embezzlement scheme." It seemed like the room was spinning. "Harold hired you, but when I mentioned your name, he acted like he'd never heard of you." He didn't want to alarm anyone, especially Sandra, until we had conclusive evidence. "Unfortunately, your investigation last week spooked her. She's been working overtime to cover her tracks, transferring money between accounts, and altering digital records. Then you know about the missing funds." "I know about more than missing funds," Derek grumbled. "Sandra hasn't just been stealing client money. She's been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, using new client deposits to cover withdrawals from accounts she's already raided. The total amount missing is approaching $400,000. $400,000. I felt my legs weaken. The entire extent of Sandra's treachery struck me like a physical blow. How many families? 18 client accounts were compromised, most of them retirees, who trusted Harold with their life savings. It was more than simply thievery. She had been methodically undermining the financial stability of elderly individuals who had saved small retirement monies over the course of their lifetimes. Margaret Williams, whose husband had been Harold's first customer, is one example. Individuals like Ruth Bailey and Thomas, who most likely were unaware that their money was gone. "There's more," said Derek. "We have evidence Sandra's been collaborating with someone at Richmond Trust Bank to facilitate the transfers. This isn't just embezzlement, it's organized financial fraud spanning multiple institutions." "What does Harold know?" "Everything. We briefed him yesterday morning. He's devastated. Joe, he built this business to help families, and his own daughter has been using it to destroy them." "What happens now?" "We're coordinating with federal investigators. Sandra will be arrested within the next 48 hours. The charges will include wire fraud, money laundering, and elder abuse. She's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison." I waited in my empty house after Derek hung up, trying to take it all in. The lady I loved and married wasn't only a thief. While her father reveled in her accomplishments, she was a predator who had been methodically preying on elderly individuals who were at risk. Her ability to steal from the people they were meant to safeguard had been the basis for every bonus Harold had awarded her and every compliment he had bestowed on her work. That night, I considered Christmas supper. Sandra's family would assemble around their tree to commemorate Kelthorne Financial's continued success. Harold would most likely give Sandra a toast for her performance and express his pride in her taking over the company. Sandra's mother would rave about her achievement, her new automobile, and her high-end wardrobe. They were unaware that their golden daughter had been ruining everything Harold had achieved over the past 2 years. I made my way to my workstation and took out the flash disk I had ready. Everything I had gathered was there, but suddenly it didn't appear to be enough in comparison to what Derek and the federal investigators had found. Nevertheless, it was my proof, my finding, and my opportunity to guarantee Sandra's victims receive justice. Dinner on Christmas Eve was in 6 hours. You have 6 hours to make a decision on the truth. As it happened, the choice was simple. I made copies of everything during the afternoon, including printed papers, many flash drives, and thorough descriptions of every hacked account. I wanted to make sure Harold and Sandra's family knew precisely what had been going on right in front of them, even if Derek and the federal investigators already had their case. Sandra came back from the salon at 4 p.m. with her hair groomed to perfection and a positive attitude. She kissed my face and remarked, "You look nice," while I straightened my tie. "Ready to go celebrate with my family?" I said, "Ready," and put the flash drive in the pocket of my blazer. Harold's residence was a weird drive. Sandra talked about her enthusiasm for the bonus Harold was going to disclose at dinner, her mother's preparations for New Year's Eve, and her cousin Ashley's new job. She squeezed my hand and remarked, "He's been hinting about something special. I think he might be ready to make me a full partner." A 12-foot tree in the living room, white lights, exquisite garland, and immaculately wrapped gifts were all part of Harold and Patricia's magazine-worthy Christmas decor. Sandra's grandma Eleanor was sitting in her favorite chair by the fireplace. Her cousins Ashley and Tyler were there with their children, and her Uncle Vincent and Aunt Rebecca were already there. Harold gave Sandra a bear embrace and said, "There's our star," as soon as we entered. I saw Sandra smile as her father praised her and as she accepted congrats from family members who had no idea they were honoring a criminal. "Come here, sweetheart. I want to tell everyone about your incredible year." Ashley, her cousin, inquired about the new BMW. Sandra's diamond bracelet received praise from her aunt, Rebecca. Sandra's grandfather would have been pleased to see her succeed. According to her grandma Eleanor, dinner was a torment. Raising his wine glass, Harold spoke about Sandra's outstanding work and her promising future as the head of Kelthorne Financial. He discussed the confidence that clients had placed in his family, the duty they felt to safeguard people's life savings, and the legacy he was honored to leave his daughter. Sandra shed tears of joy. The whole family cheered. I felt like throwing up. We gathered around the tree to exchange gifts after supper. Sandra sent gifts to those she loved and trusted that she had purchased with stolen funds. I saw Harold cry as he thanked her for her generosity and opened a pricey watch she had given him. Patricia finally proposed that we each unwrap one gift before the others are delivered on Christmas morning. The family chuckled while choosing presents at random from the stack. Sandra then reached behind the tree and took out the mail I had previously left there. She turned it over in her palms and said, "What's this one?" The Peterson family was the only recipient. Patricia wrote, "I don't recognize the handwriting," when she looked at the mail. Harold gave a shrug. Sandra ripped up the letter and said, "Perhaps someone dropped it off and we missed it." There was a single sheet of paper with the words "The truth" about how Sandra spent your Christmas money that I had typed that afternoon. The flash drive was attached to the paper underneath it. Sandra said, "What is this?" but her tone had altered. Her face was losing its color. Taking the paper, Harold read it out loud. As the significance set in, the room became quiet. "Susan," murmured Joe, "what is this?" Slowly, I got to my feet. Harold was looking at the flash drive as if it were about to blow up when he said, "It's exactly what it says. Sandra." "The truth." I turned to face Sandra and said, "What truth?" "The truth about where Sandra's been getting the money for her new car, her jewelry, and her bonuses. The truth about what happened to Thomas and Ruth Bailey's retirement fund." Sandra's expression turned pale. Family members were glancing between us around the room, their bewilderment growing into fear. "I think," softly I said, "it's time everyone knew what kind of success you've really been celebrating." Harold's hands were shaking as he put the flash drive into his laptop. With the exception of the Christmas music that continued to play subtly in the background, the living room went silent. As her family gathered behind Harold's chair to watch the TV, Sandra remained still on the couch, her face as white as paper. Harold muttered, "Dear God," when the files loaded. The proof was damning. Page after page of fabricated financial statements, actual account balances with significant deficits, and thorough records of all the thefts Sandra had perpetrated during the previous 2 years. Harold read out loud, Thomas and Ruth Bailey, his voice cracking. Statement balance, $153,000. Actual balance, $89,000. He rose to face Sandra, who remained still and silent. Sandy, what is this? Patricia, Sandra's mother, let out a gasp. The crowd exploded when someone said, "Those are the Baileys from church." Ruth has cancer. Ashley, the cousin, insisted on explanations. Uncle Vincent inquired as to if this was a joke. Grandmother Eleanor sounded as if she had been hit as she read over Harold's shoulder. Eleanor exclaimed, hardly raising her voice above a whisper, "You stole from Margaret Williams." From the Petersons. These people buried their husbands and trusted us with their futures. Harold read through several testimonies, the family being struck harder and harder by each revelation. Sandra's voice was tiny and forlorn when she eventually spoke. "I can explain. I can fix this. The money's not gone. It's just temporarily," Harold said. "Shut up." His words splintering like shattered glass. He closed the laptop and gently rose up, saying, "Just shut up." Sandra. Something was dead in his eyes when he gazed at his daughter. 27 years I've built this business. 27 years of helping families, building trust, and doing right by people who worked their whole lives for what little they had. He was increasing his volume, and you've been stealing from them, from widows, from retirees, while I bragged about your success to everyone who'd listen. Harold raised his hand before Sandra could say anything. Silently, "Get out of my house," he said. The Christmas music continued to play as Sandra clutched her handbag with trembling hands and said, "Get out and don't come back." Her mother was sobbing. Her cousin was gazing at her as if she were a stranger, and her grandmother's face was contorted with disdain as she glanced around the room at her family. She murmured, "Joe," as she arrived at the door. I shook my head. "Please," without saying another word. She walked away, saying, "The federal investigators will be in touch." I observed her drive away after sitting in her BMW for a few minutes through the window. The final present she would ever give herself was the automobile she had purchased with stolen funds. 2 days after Christmas, Sandra was taken into custody at her sister's Richmond home. Money laundering, elder financial abuse, and wire fraud were among the federal allegations. The following day, her accomplice at Richmond Trust Bank was taken into custody. The whole extent of the fraud was exposed by the investigation. $423,000 was taken from 18 households over a 26-month period. Harold permanently shut down Kelthorne Financial. The idea of carrying on a company that his daughter had used to ruin lives was too much for him to handle. Although it was insufficient to cover what Sandra had taken, he used his own retirement funds to partially compensate her victims. 60% of the money was returned to the Bailey family. Margaret Williams received 73%. It was something, but not enough to get them back inside security. Harold, who felt the weight of his daughter's misdeeds like stones in his chest, individually visited each family to apologize. Sandra was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison after entering a guilty plea to avoid a trial. During her imprisonment, a number of her victims described how her theft had made them decide between paying their rent and heating their houses, or between buying groceries and taking their medications. She never looked at the individuals whose lives she had ruined as she sat with her head down. While she was incarcerated in the county prison for punishment, I filed for her divorce. Without question, she signed the documents. I realized that her family would never speak to me again. I served as a constant reminder of their worst experience. I relocated to Charleston 6 months later and accepted a position with a tiny company that focused on elder financial protection. Every client I assisted in protecting against fraud seemed like restitution for not stopping Sandra sooner. Even if it paid less than health or financial, I sometimes questioned whether speaking up sooner would have saved anything. However, I also recall Margaret Williams maintaining her home and Thomas and Ruth Bailey receiving their money back, and I am aware that ensuring the truth was out was the only thing that mattered. The most difficult lesson I've ever learned is that love doesn't shield you from treachery. However, when justice is administered well, it may shield others from the individuals you care about the most.